Good evening, homiletics class. Thanks for tuning back in. Appreciate you watching. My name is John Paul Butler. I go by Paul, but my first name is John, which is how you know me from the forums. Coming to you tonight from Winter Haven, Florida, not too far from Southeastern, about 30 minutes from Lakeland. I was a student at Southeastern from 94 to 99, left to become a deputy sheriff, and now 20 years later, almost, I'm back to finish my degree. So I want to say thank you for Dr. Booz watching, and thanks for all the great comments that you guys had and your critiques from the last sermon. I look forward to more. Keep them coming. All good things. The title of our sermon tonight is What's Love Got to Do with It? That is a throwback Tina Turner song back from the early 80s. There's probably 3 of you watching tonight that'll even get that. Dr. Booz will. That played at his prom, I think, probably with some Huey Lewis and news. But other than that, I'm not sure if any of you guys will pick that up. We'll start tonight with a story. September 28th, 2006 was a day that started out like any other day. I was off that day from work, and my boss and I were at the gym just getting a little workout in. We were both on the SWAT team, and while we were there, he got a call that said there was an officer down, shots had been fired, and the officer was lost. Not just the officer, but also his canine partner. They were missing in the woods where they had been tracking a very bad person. We rushed to the scene and sent different groups into the woods. My group went one way, there was another group that went the other. The other group came upon the downed officer and found him there, and he had died from his injuries, and his canine partner was also dead. In the fray that happened, there was another deputy who had been shot by the bad guy, and he had been able to make it out of the woods. The only way that he made it out is the bad guy was engaged fighting the first deputy. So the deputy that died that day literally gave his life for his community and also gave his life so that other officer could live. We went into the woods the next day, found the bad guy, he shot at us, and he did not make it out. As is tradition, it was a law enforcement funeral with all the honors. People came from all over to honor this deputy and his canine partner. And at the funeral, the message that was preached, one of the verses that was included was out of John 15, greater love hath no man than to give his life for his friends. That message is at every funeral that I've been to in a line of duty death. It's often used in military funerals, and it's on the memorials and monuments that we erect for fallen officers. And that kind of hit home, that touches close, but I started thinking, what does that mean? What is the context of that? Because you never hear anything other than that one verse, and that's the text that we're going to be working out of today. So we're going to be reading from John 15, 12 through 17 out of the New International Version. My command is this, and this is Jesus talking to his disciples. My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit. Fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name the Father will give you. This is my command, love each other. So if we look at that passage starts off with Jesus saying, this is my command, love each other. And he also ends that passage by saying, this is my command, love each other. That seems to be important if Jesus has taken the time to say it twice. So let me set the stage for you here. They have finished the Last Supper. They're on the way to the garden at Gethsemane. Jesus knows that his time is short. He has told the disciples that Judas will be the one to betray him. He has told Judas to do his work quickly. And he knows that he has very little time to talk to these men who have been with him for the past 3 years of his ministry. These men that he's poured his life into, that he's poured his knowledge into, he's spent his time with, these men who have witnessed his miracles. He doesn't have very much longer to tell them what he needs to say before he goes. He's told them that he's going away, that they can't follow or go with him, but they're not in a place where they can understand that yet. So that kind of sets the stage for what we're talking about here. Now let's talk about love. In our society, love has been so diluted, has been bruised, battered, misused. And every day, love is thrown around as if it's just another word, as if it's just a butterfly flying through the air and really has no meaning. How often does somebody say, oh, I love you too, or love you, man? Is that the same as when you tell your mother or father, when you talk to them on the phone, hey, I love you, or your brother and sister, hey, I love you too? Do you love them the same way as a significant other, romantic love? That's different. How do you feel about coworkers or maybe people in your church? You say, hey, I love you too. That's the love of Christ. And that's what we're talking about here. Love in this passage in verse 12 is that deep familial type love. It is the type of love that you would have for someone that you're extremely close to and invested in. And that's what Jesus tells them, love each other as I have loved you. Well, if he is saying that he loved them, and that's the example for them to follow, then we have to look at how he loved them. One of the ways that Jesus showed his love was by saying that greater love has no one than to lay down his life for his friends. He says this because he knows that he is going to lay down his life for their sake. They are aware of the old prophecies here, but they don't want to believe it, and they haven't put everything together that's about to happen. But Jesus has, and he knows, and he's telling them, I love you so much that I'm going to give my life for you. He just told them to love each other as he loves them. So if he loves them so much that he's willing to give his life for them, then he expects them to be willing to give their lives for one another if they follow his example. This isn't a light thing. The greatest gift that God can give us is life. The greatest gift that I can give anyone else is life. If I lay down my life for someone else, there's nothing else that I can do. At the Gettysburg Address, President Abraham Lincoln, speaking of the brave men who died on the battlefield, said that they gave the last full measure of devotion by giving their life. And I think that's a pretty good way to sum up what Jesus is talking about here. And so he's telling them, I love you enough that I would lay down my life for you. We move on. You're my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends. For everything that I've learned from my Father, I've made known to you. What Jesus is saying here is the second way that he shows love to his disciples is that he doesn't call them servants, he calls them friends. This is important because a servant doesn't know the business of the master. The scripture says that. If you were in a position where you had a servant or you had a maid or had someone that tended to your needs, you generally would not concern yourself with the business of the servant because the master has his own problems to worry about. However, if you have a friend that has a problem, you concern yourself with their business. You make yourself invested into their life. What is bothering them oftentimes will bother you. They talk to you. You talk to them. You vent to one another. And Jesus is saying here that he has brought the disciples in close to him and calls them friends. In order to do that, what does he say you have to do? You have to do what he commands. What did he command? He commanded them to love each other as he has loved them. So, to do all of this, you have to be a servant of Christ. However, if you're a servant of Christ and you do what he commands, he won't call you a servant. He calls you his friend, and he brings you in close. Once he brings you in close, then he also fills you with all of the knowledge that the Father has granted him. Anything that he knew from the Father, he passed on to them, and that's what he's saying here. So the first way that Jesus shows love is by being willing to lay down his life and actually laying down his life for his friends. The second way is by calling them his friends because they do what he commands by saying to love one another. The third way that Jesus shows us love is as we find it in verse 16. He says, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit. Fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. So the third way that Jesus shows us love there is by saying, I loved you enough that I chose you. You didn't choose me. You didn't come to me because of all of your great wisdom and all of your worldly stature or anything like that. Remember, many of these disciples were regular men. Drop your nets and follow me. These weren't governors. These weren't rich men in society. Jesus still chose them and appointed them. And to me, that's touching because that means that before I was ever formed in my mother's womb, Jesus knew me. He knew me and loved me enough to call me and appoint me. Although he knew all of my faults, he knew all of my flaws, he knew my shortcomings, he knew that I could never in my own be worthy of him, he still chose me and appointed me. And he did the same for each one of you. And if you stop for a second and think about it, you let that sink in and see how important that is, that he chose us. And he chose each one of us. Not only did he choose us and appoint us, but once we go out and we bear fruit in his name, then whatever we ask in the name of Jesus, the Father will give us. So it's not just being chosen and appointed, there's an action required there. Go out and bear fruit. However, if you follow my commands, if you go out and bear fruit, then I will give you an audience with the Father, that whatever you ask in my name, he will grant. That's amazing to me. And he's telling these men who have been his friends, who have been his close personal confidants for 3 years, that he will give them an audience with the Father if they will but continue to follow his commands. And from there, he says again, this is my command, love each other. Now, if we look at command in verse 12, and we look at command in verse 17, it's two different words. Command in verse 12 is, this is my command, this is my decree, this is what I will tell you, and then I'm going to put out for you to do. Command in verse 12 is, this is my command, action, verb, go and do. So in verse 12, he's setting up by saying, guys, this is what I'm going to tell you to do. This is what I want from you. This is how I'm going to lay it out for you. And then in verse 17, he says, this is my command, love one another. Jesus knew that once he left, that he knew what would happen. He knew that people would mock and say that he wasn't the Christ, he wasn't the Messiah. If he was, how could he die? And he knew that the disciples needed one another. He knew that they would need to love one another, and if only through loving each other would they get through. So how does that apply to us today? We're all looking for love. We're all trying to find that love in the world. Some of us find it in a lot of different ways. Some of us find it in ways that aren't healthy for us. And that's something that we all struggle with. That's something that I struggle with. That's something that everyone deals with in one form or another. But here, Jesus lays out for us that if we will just love one another, what he will do, and he gives us an example. So what I'd like to do in closing is I'd like to challenge you. For the next month, not an open-ended crazy challenge, for the next month, do everything you can do to love those around you. Call those around you friends. Be willing to lay your life down. And I don't necessarily mean be willing to take a bullet. Sometimes you may have to do that. You may be in a position where that's what's called for. But sometimes it's as simple as putting things aside to be there for someone else. Laying down your life doesn't have to mean dying. It can just mean putting aside your life long enough to invest in someone else. When your friend calls and they've had a bad day, when you see a person that is in need, when God lays something or someone on your heart, put your life aside long enough to minister to the life and the needs of someone else. And in doing so, you follow Jesus' pattern that he set forth here of how to love one another. Call them friends, bear fruit. Go out and bear fruit for the kingdom and for Christ. And for the next month, each day, I challenge you, find a way to love someone around you in a way that you've never loved them before. And at the end of that month, evaluate it. And if you don't see anything different in your life, if you don't see that you're happier, if you don't see that God's rewarding you, then go on about your life. If you see that something wonderful has happened, or you're seeing a change, and that change may not be in anyone else, that change may just be within you. Loving one another may open your heart up to be loved and feel more loved by giving and investing into the lives of someone else. I hope and pray that you'll put this into your spirit. I hope that you'll study on it and think on it. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your critiques, and good luck with the remainder of your classes. Have a good night.